In a quiet town surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests, there lived a blacksmith named Samuel. His forge, a modest stone building at the edge of the village, glowed with the warmth of his craft. The rhythmic clang of his hammer was a familiar sound, a melody that marked the days for the townsfolk. Samuel's skill with metal was unmatched. His horseshoes, swords, and tools were prized by merchants and farmers alike. Yet, despite his craftsmanship and a heart as steady as his hand, Samuel was a man of few words. In a town where gossip often filled the silence, his reserved nature painted him as an enigma. Samuel's quiet life made him the subject of whispered speculation. Children dared each other to approach his workshop at night, their imaginations fueled by tales of a mysterious blacksmith who worked long after the town had fallen asleep. Some claimed he spoke to no one because he had something to hide. Others said his silence was proof of a deep, dangerous anger. Samuel, aware of the murmurs, never paid them any mind. He found solace in his craft, letting his work speak louder than words ever could. One crisp autumn evening, the town was thrown into turmoil. The wealthy merchant, Mr. Aldridge, burst from his grand house, shouting for help. His voice echoed to the cobblestone streets, drawing a growing crowd. "Thieves!" he roared, his face flushed with rage. "They've stolen my jewels, my life's fortune." Lanterns flickered as townsfolk gathered in front of his house, their breaths visible in the cold night air. Who could have done this? Mr. Aldridge demanded, his voice trembling with both anger and fear. The crowd buzzed with speculation, their voices blending into a chaotic hum. "Was it an outsider?" someone asked. "No," another replied. Whoever did this knew where to look. It had to be someone from town. From the edge of the gathering, a woman's voice rang out, trembling yet sharp. "I saw Samuel near the market last night," she said, pointing toward the shadows. Heads turned, eyes narrowing with suspicion. He was skulking about, carrying something heavy. Samuel's name spread to the crowd like wildfire. For years, he had been a quiet presence among them, always there but never truly one of them. Now, in the face of uncertainty and fear, he became an easy target. Someone muttered, "He keeps to himself too much." Another added, "We know nothing about him." Doubts and accusations piled up, creating a mountain of mistrust where there was once neutrality. By dawn, the police arrived at Samuel's workshop. The blacksmith was already at work, his hammer ringing out in sharp, deliberate strikes. He paused, wiping soot from his face as the officers entered. His expression was calm, even welcoming. "Good morning," he greeted them, his voice steady. The lead officer stepped forward, his tone heavy with authority. "Samuel, you've been accused of breaking into Mr. Aldridge's home and stealing his jewels." Samuel's hammer stilled. For a moment, the only sound was the crackling fire in the forge. He set down his tools and faced them. "I didn't do it," he said firmly, his eyes meeting theirs. "I was home all night. Anyone who knows me knows I've no interest in such things." But the officers weren't swayed. The weight of the town's suspicion pressed on them, demanding action. Shackles clicked around Samuel's wrists as they led him out of the workshop. The streets filled with townsfolk, their faces a mix of anger and curiosity. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, watching as the blacksmith walked with his head high, refusing to let shame bow him. Jeers erupted from the crowd, but Samuel didn't flinch. Deep down, he believed in the power of truth. The trial was arranged hastily, the courtroom buzzing with the whispers of an eager audience. Men and women packed the wooden benches, leaning forward to catch every word. The prosecutor painted a damning picture. Samuel, a man with no family and no alibi, had the means and the opportunity. A man who spends his life bending metal, the prosecutor argued, would have no trouble bending the rules. The townsfolk nodded along, convinced by the fervor of the accusation. Samuel sat silently, his hands clasped in front of him. When it was finally his turn to speak, he stood and addressed the room. His voice, though quiet, carried an unshakable conviction. "I'm innocent," he said simply. "I've done nothing to harm this town. My work has always been my purpose, and I have nothing more to add." From his seat at the head of the room, Judge Williams, a stern figure with graying hair and a deep frown, watched Samuel intently. The judge's piercing gaze swept over the blacksmith, his expression shifting from stern appraisal to something softer, recognition. The judge leaned forward, his fingers steepled in thought. A memory flickered in his mind, a detail he hadn't expected to find in the middle of this trial. His voice, deep and commanding, broke the tense silence. "Before we proceed," he said, drawing every eye in the room, "there's something I must share about this man." Judge Williams stood, his imposing presence commanding the room's full attention. "Before we proceed," he began, his deep voice breaking the suffocating tension, "I have something to share about this man, Samuel." The courtroom, which had been buzzing with whispers and quiet judgments moments earlier, fell silent. The judge took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the blacksmith standing humbly before him. "Several months ago," Judge Williams began, his voice steady but laced with emotion, "I was traveling on a deserted road outside this town. It was late, and the night was dark, the kind that makes every sound a threat. My carriage was suddenly ambushed by robbers." His words hung in the air, and the crowd leaned in closer, their curiosity piqued. "They surrounded my carriage," he continued, his voice growing heavier with the weight of memory. "They beat my driver, threatened my life, and demanded everything of value. I thought I wouldn't make it out alive. Then, out of nowhere, this man, Samuel, appeared." Gasps rippled through the courtroom, like the sound of wind rushing through trees. All eyes turned to Samuel, who stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the floor, his modesty shielding him from the weight of their collective attention. "Samuel fought them off," the judge continued, his voice rising slightly with admiration. "There were 3 of them, armed and dangerous, but he didn't hesitate. He risked his life to save mine. I will never forget the sound of his voice as he told me, 'Stay behind me. I'll handle this.'" The crowd sat in stunned silence, their previous judgments crumbling under the weight of this revelation. Judge Williams' voice softened as he added, outnumbered, he still didn't falter. "When the robbers fled, beaten and terrified, I offered Samuel a reward, a substantial sum, for saving me. Do you know what he did?" The judge paused, scanning the faces in the room, letting the question linger. "He refused. He said, 'I don't need your money, sir. I only did what was right.' And before I could even thank him properly, he left." The judge turned to the merchant who had first accused Samuel, his expression a blend of disappointment and stern resolve. "Mr. Aldridge, you accuse this man without a shred of evidence, based solely on your assumptions. And the rest of you," he said, his voice growing louder as he addressed the crowd, blindly followed. "You turned your backs on someone who has done nothing but serve this town with integrity and kindness." The merchant stammered, his face flushed with shame. I didn't know. I was wrong. Samuel, I am deeply sorry," he said, his voice trembling as he turned to the blacksmith. Judge Williams nodded firmly. "This man is no thief. He is a hero, and yet you all treated him as less than a man." The judge's gavel struck the sound block, his voice carrying a finality that left no room for doubt. "The case is dismissed. Samuel, you are free to go." The tension in the room dissolved into an uneasy quiet as the blacksmith's shackles were removed. Samuel stood, his calm demeanor unchanged, and walked out of the courtroom. The crowd parted before him, the same people who had jeered and cursed now stepping back with lowered eyes, their shame palpable. Outside the courthouse, the townsfolk began to approach Samuel one by one. Apologies spilled from their lips, their voices tinged with regret. "We're so sorry, Samuel," a farmer said, his hat in his hands. "We should have known better." Samuel listened quietly, his gaze steady but kind. When the apologies ceased, he spoke, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a lesson learned. Judgment without understanding only leads to harm. I forgive you, but remember this. Fear and prejudice cloud the truth. Be better than that." The crowd nodded solemnly, Samuel's words sinking deep into their hearts. They dispersed slowly, leaving the blacksmith to stand alone in the sunlight, a free man once again. In the weeks that followed, the town's perception of Samuel changed drastically. He was no longer the quiet blacksmith who worked in solitude at the edge of the village. He became a symbol of courage, humility, and integrity, a reminder of the cost of blind judgment and the power of doing what's right, even when no one is watching. Judge Williams, deeply moved by Samuel's character, became a frequent visitor to the blacksmith's forge. They often shared conversations over the rhythmic clang of the hammer, the judge offering his friendship as a way to repay a debt he felt could never truly be repaid. As time passed, the story of Samuel's trial and Judge Williams' revelation became a tale told around the town's hearts, a cautionary tale about the dangers of prejudice and the power of redemption. And Samuel, ever modest, continued his work, his hammer ringing out not just as a tool of his craft, but as a reminder of a man who had been misjudged yet stood tall in the face of it all.